A few years ago, the idea sounded almost ridiculous. Work your entire life in America, save diligently, follow the rules, and then, when retirement finally arrives, leave the country. Not for adventure, not for luxury, not because you suddenly fell in love with another culture, but because staying home became too expensive. Think about that for a moment. Millions of Americans spent decades believing retirement was the reward at the end of the journey. The final chapter. The moment when sacrifice would finally turn into security. Yet today, a growing number of retirees are packing their lives into a few suitcases and moving thousands of miles away, not because they want more, but because they fear they can no longer afford what they already have. And that's where this story begins. Because what looks like a personal financial decision is actually something much bigger. It's a warning, and most people haven't noticed it yet. The dream is surprisingly simple. Sell the house, move somewhere cheaper, stretch Social Security further, live near the ocean, eat at restaurants without checking every price, finally breathe again. Countries across Latin America, Southeast Asia, and parts of Europe have become retirement destinations for Americans searching for something that feels increasingly rare back home. Financial stability. At first glance, it's hard not to understand the appeal. A monthly income that feels tight in America can suddenly provide a comfortable lifestyle elsewhere. Rent is lower. Healthcare is often less expensive. Daily living costs can be dramatically reduced. For many retirees, the math seems obvious. Why struggle in one of the world's richest countries when your retirement savings can go twice as far somewhere else? But here's the part nobody talks about. The decision to leave isn't always about chasing opportunity. Sometimes it's about escaping pressure. And there's a difference, a very important difference. When people move somewhere because they're excited about the future, that's one story. When people move because they're afraid of what happens if they stay, that's another story entirely. And increasingly, many retirees seem to fall into the second category. The headlines often celebrate the lifestyle, the beaches, the lower costs, the freedom. What they rarely discuss is what these departures may be telling us about the country being left behind. Because retirement is supposed to represent security. If large numbers of people feel they must leave their own country to achieve that security, then perhaps the real story isn't about foreign destinations at all. Perhaps it's about what's happening at home. And this is where things start getting uncomfortable. For decades, Americans were taught a particular formula. Work hard, buy a home, save consistently, invest responsibly, retire comfortably. It wasn't guaranteed, but it felt achievable. Today, many people still believe that formula exists, but reality has been changing underneath their feet. Housing costs have risen. Healthcare expenses continue to worry retirees. Inflation has quietly reshaped household budgets. And perhaps most importantly, uncertainty has become a permanent feature of retirement planning. People don't just fear running out of money. They fear not knowing whether their money will be enough. That psychological shift matters more than many realize. Because retirement isn't only about finances. It's about confidence. It's about waking up and believing tomorrow will be manageable. When confidence disappears, people begin looking for alternatives, even drastic ones. And so a growing number of Americans are making a calculation that would have seemed unthinkable to previous generations. They're asking a question that cuts deeper than spreadsheets and budgets. They're asking, can I afford to grow old where I spent my entire life? The fact that this question exists at all may be one of the most revealing stories in modern America, because what we're witnessing may not simply be a retirement trend. It may be a sign that the relationship between citizens and economic security is changing in ways few people fully understand. And in a moment, we'll explore something even more surprising. Because moving abroad solves some problems, but it also creates new ones. Problems that many retirees never see coming until they're already living them. And those hidden risks reveal something even larger about the future of retirement itself. Before we continue, if these kinds of conversations help you see familiar issues from a different perspective, consider subscribing. Not because anyone has all the answers, but because understanding the forces reshaping everyday life has never been more important. The brochures rarely mention loneliness. The YouTube videos rarely focus on uncertainty. And the retirement success stories almost never spend much time discussing what happens after the excitement fades. Because moving abroad often feels like solving a financial problem. But retirement was never only a financial experience. It's a human experience. And those are very different things. Imagine spending 40 years building a life in one place. Your routines, your neighbors, your favorite restaurants, the streets you know without thinking, the familiar voices, the unspoken comfort of belonging. Then one day, you leave. Not for a vacation, not for a few months, but permanently. At first, everything feels exciting. The lower costs are real. The weather may be better. The pace of life feels slower. Many retirees describe an initial sense of relief. For the first time in years, they aren't constantly calculating expenses. They aren't worrying about every bill. They feel free. But here's the part nobody talks about. Relief and belonging are not the same thing. And eventually, the difference begins to matter. Because human beings are remarkably adaptable, but they're also deeply social creatures. The older we become, the more important relationships often become, not less. A retirement plan can account for rent. It can account for healthcare. It can account for food. But how do you calculate the value of having your children 20 minutes away? How do you put a price on seeing grandchildren grow up? How do you measure the comfort of lifelong friendships? These questions rarely appear in retirement calculators. Yet they may be among the most important factors of all. And this is where the conversation becomes much bigger than retirement. Because what we're really discussing is the increasing tendency to treat economic problems as individual problems. Can't afford housing? Move somewhere cheaper. Can't afford retirement? Move to another country. Can't afford healthcare? Find a lower-cost alternative. The solutions may work for some individuals, but they don't necessarily solve the underlying issue. In fact, they may quietly normalize it. Think about that. Every time people adapt to a system becoming harder to navigate, the system itself experiences less pressure to change. The burden shifts from institutions to individuals, from society to the person, from collective responsibility to personal adjustment. At first, this looks like resilience, but sometimes it's something else. Sometimes it's accommodation, and those two things are not always the same. Throughout American history, economic mobility often meant moving toward opportunity. Families relocated to growing cities. Workers followed expanding industries. People migrated in pursuit of a better future. Today's retirement migration feels different. Many retirees aren't moving toward greater opportunity. They're moving away from rising costs, away from financial pressure, away from uncertainty. That distinction matters, because it changes the emotional character of the decision. One movement is driven by hope. The other is often driven by fear, and fear has a way of reshaping entire societies. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. Then there's another issue few people discuss openly. A retirement strategy that depends heavily on another country's lower cost of living assumes that those conditions remain stable. But the world isn't standing still. Popular retirement destinations are changing too. Housing costs in many expatriate communities have risen. Local economies evolve. Exchange rates fluctuate. Political conditions shift. Healthcare systems face their own pressures. The cheap paradise many retirees imagine is often less permanent than it appears. And this is where things get uncomfortable, because some retirees may be making life-changing decisions based on a snapshot of today's reality. But retirement can last 20 or even 30 years. That's a long time to bet on stability, especially in an increasingly unstable world. Yet perhaps the most revealing aspect of this trend isn't the risks retirees face abroad. It's the fact that so many people are willing to accept those risks in the first place. That willingness tells us something important. People generally don't leave familiar environments, social networks, and cultural comfort zones unless they believe the alternative is worse. The decision itself is the signal, and that signal raises a difficult question. If retirement abroad continues growing, what exactly are Americans trying to escape? The answer may have less to do with foreign countries, and much more to do with changing expectations inside the United States. Because beneath every retirement decision lies a deeper story about what people believe their future will look like. And right now, that belief appears to be changing. In the next part, we'll explore why this trend isn't just about retirees at all, because younger generations are watching, and what they're learning may have consequences that reach far beyond retirement. Here's what makes this story far more significant than most people realize. The people leaving today are not the only ones affected. Millions of younger Americans are watching, quietly, carefully, and drawing conclusions. Because every generation learns from the generation ahead of it. Not from speeches, not from political slogans, from observation. People watch what happens to their parents, their grandparents, their neighbors, their co-workers, and then they adjust their expectations accordingly. That process is happening right now. Imagine being 35 years old. You've worked hard. You're contributing to retirement accounts. You're trying to make responsible decisions. Then you watch people who spent 40 years doing exactly what they were supposed to do, and many of them still feel financially vulnerable in retirement. What lesson do you take from that? For some, the lesson becomes motivation. Save more. Invest more. Plan better. But for others, a different conclusion begins to emerge. A far more troubling one. What if the game itself has changed? What if the traditional retirement model no longer delivers the certainty it once promised? And this is where the conversation moves beyond economics. Because confidence is one of the most important resources any society possesses. When people believe effort leads to stability, they invest in the future. They save. They build. They commit. They take long-term risks. But when confidence weakens, behavior changes. People become shorter-term thinkers. They become more cautious, more anxious, more focused on immediate survival than future growth. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It happens gradually. One decision at a time. One adjustment at a time. One compromise at a time. Until eventually, an entire generation begins approaching life differently. And there are signs that this may already be occurring. Many younger Americans increasingly express skepticism toward traditional milestones. Home ownership, retirement timelines, long-term financial planning, institutionnelle promise. The reasons are complex, but retirement migration may be contributing to the broader perception that financial security is becoming harder to achieve. Not impossible, just less predictable, and unpredictability has consequences. Because human beings can tolerate hardship surprisingly well, what they struggle with is uncertainty. A difficult future can be planned for. An unknown future creates anxiety. That's why the image of retirees leaving America resonates so strongly. It isn't merely about geography. It's symbolic. It challenges a deeply rooted assumption, the assumption that after decades of work, security naturally follows. When that assumption weakens, people begin questioning other assumptions too. And this is where things get really interesting, because the retirement abroad phenomenon reveals a contradiction at the heart of modern life. Americans have access to more information than any generation in history. More technology, more convenience, more consumer choice. Yet many people feel less secure. Not necessarily poorer, less secure. Those are different things. Security isn't measured only by income. It's measured by predictability, by confidence, by the feeling that the ground beneath you will remain stable tomorrow. Many retirees moving abroad are effectively searching for that feeling. Not merely lower costs, not merely sunshine, not merely beaches. They're searching for predictability, for breathing room, for a sense of control. And who can blame them? The desire itself is completely understandable. But here's the deeper question. What happens when increasing numbers of citizens must cross borders to find the sense of security they once expected at home? Notice that this question isn't about patriotism. It's not about whether leaving is right or wrong. People should absolutely make the choices that best serve their lives and families. The real issue is what the trend reveals, because trends are messages. And this one may be sending a message about the growing gap between economic possibility and economic confidence. A gap that affects far more than retirees. A gap that touches workers, families, young adults, and future generations. And that leads us to perhaps the most important question of all. What if retiring abroad isn't the destination? What if it's the symptom? Because symptoms point toward larger forces beneath the surface. Forces that remain invisible until enough people start making the same unusual decision. And in the final part, we'll explore what those forces might be and why the future of retirement could look very different from anything previous generations imagined. So let's return to the question we started with. Why are increasing numbers of Americans choosing to retire abroad? The obvious answer is cost. But by now, it's clear that cost is only the surface-level explanation. The deeper story is about something far more powerful. Trust. Trust in the future. Trust that decades of work will produce lasting security. Trust that the systems people relied upon will continue functioning as expected. And when trust begins to weaken, people adapt. That's what human beings do. They search for alternatives. They look for escape routes. They create backup plans. They hedge against uncertainty. Retirement abroad may be one of the clearest examples of that adaptation in modern America. Not because everyone is leaving, not because retirement is impossible, but because the conversation itself has changed. A generation ago, many retirees asked, "Where do I want to spend my retirement?" Today, a growing number are asking, "Where can I afford to spend my retirement?" At first glance, the difference seems subtle. In reality, it's enormous. One question is driven by aspiration. The other is driven by constraint. And societies change when enough people begin thinking in terms of constraints rather than possibilities. But here's the part nobody talks about. This story is not entirely negative. In fact, there is something surprisingly hopeful hidden inside it, because the willingness of retirees to reinvent their lives demonstrates something remarkable about human adaptability. Think about it. Many people spend decades in one country, one culture, one routine, yet later in life, they make an extraordinary leap into the unknown. They learn new systems, new communities, new ways of living. That's courage. Whether one agrees with the decision or not, it reflects a profound human capacity to adjust when circumstances change. And perhaps that's the larger lesson. The future rarely unfolds exactly as people expect. The retirement model that shaped the 20th century may not be the retirement model that defines the 21st. Longer life expectancies, global mobility, remote financial management, changing housing markets, shifting healthcare realities. All of these forces are reshaping what retirement means. The question is whether institutions will adapt as quickly as individuals have been forced to adapt. Because individuals can only absorb so much pressure before larger structural questions emerge. Questions about affordability, questions about aging, questions about economic security, questions about what citizens should reasonably expect after a lifetime of contribution. These are not partisan questions. They are human questions. And they will become increasingly important in the years ahead. The retirees leaving today are, in a sense, early indicators. Like canaries in a coal mine, not predicting catastrophe, not signaling collapse, but revealing shifts that others may not yet fully see. The most important mistake would be dismissing this trend as merely a collection of personal lifestyle choices, because large social changes often begin exactly that way. One family makes a decision, then another, then another. Eventually, a pattern emerges, and patterns tell stories. The story here is not that America is failing, nor is it that retirement abroad is a perfect solution. Reality is more complicated than either narrative. The real story is that millions of people are trying to navigate a world where the traditional assumptions of economic life feel less certain than they once did. They're searching for stability, for dignity, for control, for the ability to enjoy the years they spent decades working toward. And perhaps that's the uncomfortable truth hiding underneath this entire conversation. Most people don't actually want luxury. Most people don't expect perfection. What they want is something much simpler. They want to believe that a lifetime of effort will eventually provide peace of mind. When that belief feels threatened, people start making extraordinary decisions. Sometimes those decisions involve crossing oceans. Sometimes they involve starting over. Sometimes they involve leaving behind everything familiar, not because they want to, because they feel they have to. And whether retirement abroad continues growing or eventually slows down, that feeling is the real story. Because once a society begins questioning where security can be found, it's really asking a much bigger question. What does a good life look like now? And perhaps even more importantly, who can still afford it? If this discussion gave you something to think about, consider subscribing and joining future conversations. Not for predictions or easy answers, but for a deeper look at the forces quietly reshaping everyday life, often long before most people notice they're happening. Thanks for watching.